So let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out at this incredibly busy time of year to join this important webinar. My name is Charlotte O'Mara and I'm the Head of Responsible Investment at Challenger, and I have the great privilege of being able to moderate this webinar today to launch the expert guide that Altiorem has been working on integrating human rights due diligence in ESG, a guide for investors. And so we've had quite a few people who have contributed to this expert guide, myself included, and a few of those people are on the webinar today to work through it. But it's an incredibly exciting piece that is going to be released now for investors to look at. So we'll go through it today and talk about the incredible importance of human rights due diligence. So on the agenda today, I will give you an overview of the expert guide in the first instance. I'll introduce our excellent panel, and then we will get into a discussion about the importance of human rights due diligence in finance and investment. We will have 15 minutes for questions at the end, so please think about the questions and pop them in the chat box as we go through. And we will also be including a link to the expert guide so you can start working through it after the webinar finishes today, and sharing it with your teams as well, which is something I will certainly be doing after this webinar. So moving on to the introduction to our fantastic panel today. So as you can see on the screen, we've got quite a few experts in the field. So Saskia Court, the former CEO of Telco Together Foundation, will be joining us on the panel today. Gabe Wilson-Otto, the Head of Sustainable Investing Strategy from Fidelity, and Nina Haisler, human rights and sustainability professional, who has decades of experience in this field and has also recently just moved to New York. So we're really lucky to have her here joining us today. And we also need to talk about those who have contributed to the expert guide. So those of us on the panel, we've had a small contribution, but really driving this important expert guide are two very important people. Matthew Coughlin, who's a business and human rights consultant who many of us know from his work over the years, particularly his work at Walk Free, and Ella Taylor, who's the Altiorem Research Associate and Monash Law student. So without their important involvement driving this initiative, we wouldn't have this expert guide today. So calling them out is very important. So I will now take you through briefly the expert guide, who the guide is for, what human rights due diligence is in ESG investing for those that may not be familiar with it, why human rights due diligence matters for investors, particularly at this current moment in time where we are in the world and geopolitical issues that are facing us, and how investors can integrate human rights due diligence into their own process. So who is the target audience of this expert guide? And it really is investors in ESG stewardship and responsible investment roles. So those of us who are working every day with our investment teams on integrating ESG, and in particular integrating human rights into the ESG process. But it isn't just exclusively for ESG professionals. It's also relevant to banks, lenders, anyone in procurement and supply chain roles, those in modern slavery or human rights teams, governance, risk and compliance people, people in legal teams, professional services and ESG advisors. So while it is that specific target audience, there's a broader audience that this would appeal to. So the what is human rights due diligence in finance and investment? And as you can see there, human rights due diligence focuses on identifying and managing human rights impacts, which are increasingly recognized as financially material risks in regulatory frameworks. And so the UN guiding principles provide guidance on the core human rights due diligence process, which is assessing impacts, acting on findings, tracking effectiveness, and communicating the outcomes. And there are regulatory drivers for this as well. So there's the soft law, there's the UN guiding principles, OECD guidelines, some of those international norms that we all follow. But there's also mandatory requirements, those that are currently in place and those that are emerging. So those of us in Australia know very well the requirements of the Modern Slavery Act, and then the proposed discussion points that are up for discussion and consultation at the moment with the Modern Slavery Act review. In Europe, there's SFDR, duty of vigilance, supply chain laws. But what is also emerging that we talk a lot about is the CSDDD, and then some other pieces of legislation as well in Korea and Thailand. So human rights due diligence is moving more into the regulatory space, but it is something that should be of a focus area for everybody in their investment process. And so, why does human rights due diligence matter now? And I think that at this particular moment in time, we could arguably say human rights due diligence matters more now than ever before. There are many investor risks, legal and regulatory exposure, operational disruption, litigation that's on foot. We also have a lot of geopolitical risks, human rights violations across the world. In all different types of human rights. But if we think about the impact and the disruption of geopolitical events on people and increasing the vulnerability of people, this is an issue that matters more than it ever has before and poses a significant investor risk. But there are also investor opportunities, stronger stewardship opportunities, particularly in collaborative engagement, future proofing our portfolios, and differentiating our ESG processes. And there's also systemic relevance. And when we think about systems thinking and the importance of systems thinking in our processes at the moment, there is systemic relevance in human rights due diligence, and that's becoming a market expectation. And ensuring that we are, as we're considering the importance of our upstream and downstream value chain, considering that in the context of human rights due diligence is very important. And so very briefly, how this slide, the next two slides show how investors can integrate human rights due diligence. Now, this is in a lot more detail in the expert guide, which I'd encourage you to read, but this really details working through the different processes and where you can integrate human rights due diligence. So the pre-investment screening process is an incredibly important place to start. Completing a human rights risk assessment once potential risks are flagged, and you need to do a deeper dive to understand their severity and the impact to the portfolio. This assessment should then flow through to your portfolio decision-making process and how you can use leverage, and that's different depending on which asset class you're talking about, but really using that leverage in the portfolio decision-making process. Engagement and stewardship. So after you have even before you have deployed the capital, but after as well, integrating human rights due diligence into your engagement and stewardship process is very important, and that's where you can really see some good human rights outcomes when you engage on this issue. And then moving on to the next slide, monitoring and tracking effectiveness. So really making sure that human rights due diligence is appropriately monitored, tracked, and that you're thinking about the affected workers and communities in particular, and that is a focus of your monitoring, where you might set some KPIs as well to track that effectiveness. A focus on remediation when harm occurs. And I think we are all ESG professionals who would be on this webinar today are familiar with victim-centered remediation, and that's incredibly important to be a focus of your remediation activity, and also the escalation mechanisms that you might deploy in the event of harm. Documentation and disclosure. So transparency is critical, and we've seen that in Australia with the Modern Slavery Act reporting, but across the world we're seeing more disclosure around human rights due diligence, and we need to see more of that. And that's a potential engagement and stewardship activity as well, is increasing the transparency and disclosure on this issue. And finally, governance, resourcing, and capability. So having policies, resources, training in place for your investment and stewardship functions, but more broadly across any of the areas of your organizations and your investment process, which may be impacted by human rights. And where human rights risks may impact those areas of the business, having effective policies and resources for those functions is really important as well. And so here's a brief case study to show you, I guess, the integration of human rights due diligence and human rights due diligence in action. So Storebrand, the sustainable investment manager and pension fund in Norway, assessed the impacts of Indigenous rights risks that were linked to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so they used their leverage collectively and engaged with the companies in detail. And the outcome was that this improved the company disclosure, and the escalation actually led to divestment when the risks remained unmitigated. So this shows that human rights due diligence integration across all aspects of your investment process, from risk assessment through to engagement and stewardship, finally to decision making, is incredibly important for the outcomes of people and communities of the investments that you're considering or that you have in your portfolios. So that is the end of that brief presentation, but now we've got time where we can really focus in on our panel discussion and really asking how human rights due diligence is implemented in practice, and how we can take an expert guide like this and really implement it into our own investment processes. So now opening up to the panel, so Saskia, Nina and Gabe, thank you so much for joining us today. Starting off with a question, I think for all of you, but maybe Gabe, we'll start with you. How have you applied human rights due diligence in your investment practice, both for risk assessment and stewardship and company engagement?
Thanks, Charlotte, and pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, this is going to be a relatively long answer, so I'll try and punch through it quickly because there's a lot to cover, but I'll move through quickly, and then if there are additional questions, we can deal with it a little bit later. But effectively, when I think about how we approach this, there's a few different levels. The first just starts around minimum standards, and so we do screening for issuers and have an exclusion approach where we believe that there are gross violations of human rights or other issues, where we believe that there's also limited scope for remediation or effective engagement. So this can result in exclusions being applied to any of our funds with sustainable or binding characteristics associated with them. We also have a process of looking at the fundamental risks to an investment and also the real world impact from human rights issues by integrating them into our own due diligence and ESG ratings. So the same person who's making a decision to say, is this a recommended buy for a company, is also the person who's analyzing the human rights risks in their supply chain, and that's being integrated into their perception of fair value. So effectively, what are the risks to cash flows? What are the reputational risks? How does this impact the company? So this is looking at much more of that fundamental side as to, does this influence an investment decision? We also have minimum standards integrated into different products and different product ranges, where it could be a positive element, making a company with strong practices more likely to be included in portfolios. And then also, so that can have an important signaling effect around trying to highlight that better practices are being rewarded by inclusion in investment universes. And so that's more of the fundamental side of the different tools and levers we have for integrating and assessing human rights. On an engagement side, there's two different lenses that we take for engagement. We have a set of 4 systemic themes that we try and drive broader change on. And one of those involves broader social issues and human rights. And so we have a structured approach of looking for where within the system we believe we can have the most impact and trying to prioritize engagements. And this can be at a regulator level or system level through, you were highlighting some of the, my favorite topic, which is regulation in Europe, and talking through SFDR, the new framework that's come out, CSRD, CSDDD, all of the acronyms, and looking at how we can influence those outcomes to get more robust and practical regulation implemented. It's also looking at an issuer level and industry level to see where we can collaborate with others and drive change through initiatives such as Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking, Asia Pacific, and other collaborative engagements. So that's more of the structured side with the individual milestones, targeting, and prioritization. We also do engagement on a much more reactive basis. So this is where an issue has been discovered in a portfolio, or an individual portfolio manager is seeking to effectively try and mitigate some of the risks that they've identified. So they come to our team and look for assistance on how to structure and lead that engagement. So that's very collaboratively with our investment teams. But I'll leave it there. There's a heap we could talk about, but just conscious of handing it over to others to chip in.
I think I really like what you say there about reactive versus proactive, and I think in our example, in our experience on engagement as well, doing that collaborative engagement, it can be a lot more proactive. So Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking is a great example where you can do a lot more policy advocacy, try and get ahead and maintain that issue. Up at the government level and really advocate in the market. But I think, there's also the reactive element as well, which is where the human rights due diligence process is really important. Saskia, do you have anything to add about how you have applied human rights due diligence in investment practices over the years?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to try to focus on a couple of different aspects on the one that Gabe has mentioned. And I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of what investors who are doing due diligence are doing. So I'm going to try to pick up on some of the things a little bit more that were also mentioned in your slide previously. I think one that is really important, if you're thinking about starting doing more human rights due diligence, it's really important that everybody has the same base level of understanding of what you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it, and how you're going to do it. So I think a couple of things that were, you had it as the last letter in the slide with all the letters, is the governance and the policies. And I think that that can be a really good starting point as well, rather than doing at the end, because if you bring together a group internally to set the baseline of what is it that we're actually trying to do, you can have some really solid conversations and debates that will then decide the processes that you're going to follow afterwards. I think the second one that is also really important to execute everything that Gabe has mentioned is the training of the investment teams. Generally speaking, investment teams are often have a financial background, an economics background, an MBA. They are not necessarily human rights experts. They might be aware of human rights issues on a high level, but really, they're not going to be familiar with the OECD guidelines. They're not going to be familiar with the UN guiding principles, the difference between soft law and hard law, and the slides with lots of mandatory frameworks being implemented around the globe, and then trying to translate that into the investment process is a really tricky thing. So I think focusing a lot on training as part of your human rights due diligence approach is really important as well, to get everybody along on the journey so that you can then actually start to effectively integrate it into the investment process. Part of that, I would also say, do the proactive and active engagement is be very clear upfront in terms of what you're trying to achieve, what are the engagement goals, setting your metrics in advance, and then having that consistent monitoring and following up throughout the engagements. I do think we're talking here like this is all very easy to do. I do think that human rights due diligence and integration from an ESG perspective is potentially one of the more tricky things to do. And I think that that really has to do with the fact that these issues are, you're trying to identify something that may go wrong potentially in the future. And that is really, really difficult. A lot of the human rights issues, they become financially material when something has gone wrong, when there's an incident, when there's a strike, when there's unfortunately loss of life, when there's a reputational issue, media headlines. So how do you develop a framework that you can assess these issues upfront? What are the KPIs that you're looking for? What are the metrics that you're looking for? What is the reporting that you're actually reviewing? Is it company reporting? And I think we're going to go into data and other things as well. But trying to establish that beforehand as well, and then work with the investment teams to integrate that further. And I'm going to pause here so that we can move on to Nina before we spend the entire session on this.
And Nina, do you have anything else to add to those excellent answers?
I think we've had a pretty good coverage so far. I'm happy to move on. I guess Saskia sort of made the point as well. Like it's risk to people. We're focusing on making sure that, you know, you can't just have one individual in an organization responsible for human rights, like mitigating adverse human rights impacts. And that means, you know, that you need to train your staff, you need to have the support, but also there are already systems. I can guarantee everyone who's joined in to this call today, they would be information like ESG tools. There would be know your customer technology that has country screening information. Like I guarantee if you do a little bit of a gap analysis internally, there are probably, you have access to these tools which have some of these information factors that we refer to in the guide in terms of like high risk country zones as well. So I just really think it's important to do an internal sort of gap analysis and to understand what your teams are currently doing and where it intersects with mitigating adverse human rights impacts.
And I think that's such a good point that everyone has raised, is really focusing in on that risk to people and having the training and the tools and resources to make sure that all teams, because it is across, as you've all said, it's a cross-functional, cross-business unit issue. It's not just one business unit that needs to be focusing on this. It's not just the ESG team. So making sure that they're trained appropriately on risk to people is incredibly important. So Nina, maybe starting with you on the next question around the practical tools, data sources or methods that you know of that could help investors to really integrate human rights due diligence into their processes.
Yeah, so I was just going to say as well in terms of like company engagement. So just like simply putting it together for the people on the line, if you're in a meeting with the executives, if you're in a meeting with the board, like asking questions about human rights related controversies that have happened previously, things that you might see on the horizon. And I guess in terms of doing that engagement, it is important to have a look at what's happening in the UN sphere, like what's happening in the world in terms of what are human rights? Like, do you have a good understanding of what are human rights? There's the positive and then there's the negative human rights. So what sort of human rights do we think might be potentially impacted for this organization or be critical in terms of that like severity and likelihood analysis drawing back to. So, and even things like letter writing as well, I think is a really important and underutilized ESG engagement, human rights engagement tool. But in terms of the tools and data sources, so I think even things like news monitoring. So often companies, investors have a subscription to something like Factiva or another news monitoring service that often the ESG teams do not use in terms of how often they should. So I think you can add flags and human rights related flags to those sort of screening services. And even publicly available sources like the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. So they have a whole list of, you can search up companies, private and public companies. You can see what sort of adverse human rights impacts they've experienced and how the company has responded as well. So that's an example of a publicly available source. And obviously there's the Global Slavery Index. There's lots of different indices available where you can download the tools and data metrics for if you are at an organization that doesn't already have access to ESG monitoring tools or external service providers, engagement providers as well. So there's really, I think often you hear people say, we just don't have the tools. And I think often it's an excuse because I'm like, I have so much information, like in my decade of working as a human rights professional, it's never been an issue of not having enough information. The issue has been that on the ground contact and actually making sure, that sort of information I think is really lacking. The worker voice is really lacking. I don't think in terms of like needing more tools to do like risk assessments, I don't think that's necessarily like a gap in the market. There's a lot of information there. It's just people don't have the time to utilize them properly.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point about worker voice and the lack of information around that, which is quite substantial. Saskia, do you have any other sources or data or recommendations for investors about how to really integrate this from a data perspective in their process?
So my recommendation would build on what Nina is saying, is use a variety of data sources. Often you see conflicting information in data sources, particularly if there's been an incident. It might be that what you're either hearing from the company or reading from the company can be quite contradictory to NGO reports on the ground, or there might be inconsistency between a company saying we found 0 issues in our audit and an NGO reports on issues on the ground. So how are you going to prepare yourself if you have an engagement with that company coming up? So I would say to building on what Nina is saying, is it takes a lot of work because you have to go through a lot of different data points, a lot of different news sources to actually build a full picture of what potentially the issue could be. And that really can help you inform the investment process. Unfortunately, that's not an easy answer because it's quite time consuming, but I think it's really well worth the effort to ensure that you're prepared with the fact of what has happened or where a company needs to improve. And that will help having a more effective engagement with the company.
Yeah, and I think having multiple data sources is very important, particularly from the perspective of lagged information. Some ESG data providers might have a certain level of information that others don't have, and I think making sure you're just accessing things from different sources means you'll have more of a chance of getting the most up-to-date information, particularly on controversies. Gabe, do you have any other data sources to add to the mix?
I might just quickly build on what Nina and Saskia have said, because I think I would completely agree with what was being said to date. For me, one of the really important elements is to recognise the availability of data, quality, and what it is measuring and what it's not measuring. And so I think that contextual, on the ground, case company specific information can be a lot harder to find than broader risk screening information. So depending on where you sit in the funnel, you've got a different information or different importance of contextual information. And so I think that at the start of the funnel, there's great information around risks of different sectors, geographies, activities, and you can build up a pretty good vision of where in your investment universe the high risk areas might be that you might need to do more work on. And then as Saskia was highlighting, this is where it starts to get quite difficult around the on the ground reality versus what a company might be saying. Most of the information you'll get from third party data providers that are commercially available are what I like to refer to as input metrics, not output metrics. So their frameworks, their policies, their tools, their X audits performed, you rarely get the granular output of those actions. And so it's typically only when there is a controversy or event that you then have that surface that you can then look and do more detail and trying to evaluate, okay, is this correct? Speaking to civil society, speaking to the company, speaking to industry associations and others to build up that picture. So it's not having a false sense of comfort from the data that you've screened or analysed and knowing when to go deeper and the different data sources that can be used for that. So it's recognising more of the limitations. So I completely agree with Nina's comments that there's a huge amount of data here and you can do a lot of work. I also think that what we find in our own process is that we run into a wall where we need to either validate that information or get more on the ground insights in order to turn it into something more actionable. So as you get down the funnel, the sources of information can shift and you might need more fundamental research or civil society or on the ground insights in order to cut through some of that haze.
Yeah, that's I like the way that you've presented it as that funnel, and really getting more granular on those sources as you go down the funnel. So we've discussed data, and Nina, as you said, that's often the point that people use to say we don't have enough data, we don't have enough resources, and so we've just dispelled that myth in this conversation. But if we take data to the side, where do you all have a view on where you think current human rights due diligence processes might be falling short in organizations and investment management teams? Who'd like to start there? Maybe Saskia, do you have a view on where you think they might be falling short?
I was trying to quickly pull up a statistic, but I think there was a report, this was on a corporate level, not on an investor level, from KPMG that was done, I think it was last year, looking at the ASX top 25 and in terms of how many companies actually do due diligence appropriately. None of the companies were fully embedded their responsibility under the UN guiding principles, and the disclosure of human rights due diligence by Australian companies was severely lacking. And I think that's quite a shocking statistic if you look at corporate reporting. And if you take that as the information that corporates report, that hugely influences what investors can do in terms of the access that we have available to assess what companies are doing. Because if they're not reporting on their human rights due diligence, then how are we able to assess what they're doing? We already talked about the other data sources that are available, but it's the reason I'm mentioning that because I think it's quite important to understand the starting point that we're having when trying to implement human rights due diligence effectively on the investor side. I think it goes back to what I was mentioning earlier in terms of how to get started is what is it that you're trying to achieve and where do you want to go? And I think from an investor point of view, you've got different options. Either you can go narrow and really deep, so go with a couple of companies on a particular issue and really try to move the bar. You could do that either through collaborative engagement, or you could say, these companies are already covered by a collaborative engagement initiative. We're picking in a company with a high risk in a different area and really want to move that company forward. Or you could take a much broader approach and engage with more companies, but potentially be less able to achieve the desired outcome because you're stretched more thinly. So I think those type of conversations you need to have internally before you decide where you want to go with your human rights due diligence program.
Gabe, do you have a view on where you think the human rights due diligence might be falling short across either corporates or investment teams or both?
I think that this probably, so part of it comes back to more of a philosophical topic of what you're trying to achieve. And so falling short against what? And so there is, what I find is that there are different ways that asset managers or industry participants approach it. Some are an exclusion first approach to the topic, which is trying to ensure that you remove risk from a portfolio and you remove the potential for negative headlines. You can make an argument around a theory of change of influence in cost of capital and signaling to companies that this is inappropriate behavior. That's one bucket. The other bucket is much more around a mindset of we can have more influence if we have a seat at the table and trying to drive change through investing and implementing and influencing as an asset owner. I think that on both sides, there are challenges in implementation and effectiveness. And so on more of the exclusion side, you typically have a lot of reputational risk, and most managers adopt third-party standards for this. So it will be a MSCI says X or public exclusion list says Y, and therefore you're outsourcing your human rights due diligence to a third party and implementing their standards. So it's about whether that's aligned with your objective and what you're trying to achieve, and whether it's more granular and you're doing the work and having more influence on those outcomes. So that's one area of limitation from that approach. And for the influence side, I find that it's often the education required across a large number of people to have effective implementation of risk mitigation and identification, and also resolution of the issues once they're resolved. So this is where we have a benefit and a challenge from it, in that we have a large analyst network that does their work, that they do all of the engagements. They do some of the engagements with us, and they are also speaking to the companies regularly. So they're way more better positioned to understand the issues and to integrate and mitigate some of the issues. The problem is that you have a large number of people you need to skill up and get onto the same page around what constitutes human rights violations in different sectors, in different geographies. What are the warning signs? How do you actually dig into this? And how do you effectively influence or even identify? And so it's on that implementation layer that I see there's a lot of challenges within the industry around consistency and around getting people to the same level.
Yeah, yeah, go, Nina.
You go, Charlotte, you go.
No, I was just about to ask, what's your view on this, Nina? I think that both of those points that have been raised are really excellent, and I think it's back to what you said at the beginning, Gabe, the proactive versus reactive. I think there's a bit less of the proactive approach of really thinking deeply about what objective you want in this particular area in terms of human rights. But Nina, what's your view on where you think the processes might be falling short?
I think in terms of what should an investor's involvement be in remediation. So obviously that depends on what asset class. So if it's private equity, you can, maybe you have some members on the board, maybe you can really be directly involved in ensuring that you remediate any adverse human rights abuses. And that could be non-judicial things like apologies, compensation, and it could be, going through like the judicial process as well. So it's, I think, in some asset classes, it's obviously easier. In listed equities, it's really difficult, especially in terms of when it's like a sensitive area or topic, like Indigenous rights related issues. Should investors be in the room with those communities hearing about, the Jukupa and how it's been, adversely impacted? So through, tangible cultural heritage loss, so things like that. What's our role to be involved in those conversations? We want to make sure that we're making things better for people and we're not further complicating the process and making it harder for those affected communities to get remediation. And also there's sometimes issues like the ArcelorMittal disaster in Kazakhstan, where 46 miners were killed in 2024. Like, how do you get involved there to ensure that there's proper remediation? There can't be proper remediation when people are killed. Lives have been lost. You can make sure that they're paying for their family's school. You can make sure that there's funeral costs paid for, that there's widow pension funds. You can, investors can still be involved in, that sort of oversight, but what level of involvement are we in the community? And I don't think like this guide answers that, of course. I think that's still something that we're trying to get our heads around, like what level of communication and involvement do we need to be in that remediation process. So I think definitely we need to hear more from communities themselves. Like maybe they don't want investors involved at all in that process. It's just more making sure, that we're having meetings with the company and hearing that those things are being done. So definitely think more work needs to be done on that.
And your response leads really well into the next question that we have about tailoring the human rights due diligence process per asset class. So you've spoken about, I guess we'll stay with you for the moment, Nina. You've spoken about remediation and how that can be tailored per asset class. But what about other areas of human rights due diligence? How do you think that should be tailored for the different asset classes?
Yep. So, for example, taking like private equity again, you can make sure your portfolio companies do a human rights gap analysis. As soon as you, do the due diligence on that company, you can do a human rights gap analysis. And then once you have equity in that company, you can make sure that they have their own human rights due diligence approaches. So you can really be much more active there. And you see, like I've seen some really fantastic things with different investment managers really integrating human rights due diligence throughout the companies that they invest in, and really making sure that they're targeted to what, whether it's a food manufacturing business or a telecommunication company, like making sure they're really addressing those salient human rights issues. So I think in terms of it's obviously if it's like sovereign debt and things like that, it can be really good to look at those, country related metrics. And we obviously see that. I think people don't connect things like, what happened with Russia and the war in Ukraine. Like those all are things that, have been flagged for a long time. So it's not, I think it's very, there's a lot of work that's already happening across different asset classes. It's just about like connecting that human rights related lens. So I think I'll let listed equities we've probably spoken about quite a bit, but I'll pass on to someone else.
Gabe, do you have any recommendations for how to tailor it per asset classes and the different considerations for different asset classes in this area?
So completely agree with Nina's comments. Would just very quickly add that different asset classes will give you a different information environment and different levers for influence. And so private equity is the pointy end of potential information environment and influence, where if you want to know what's happening, you can spend more money as the owner of the asset or influence the due diligence process. You can set up contracting terms for third-party providers. You can choose what suppliers you have depending on the level of control and influence you have of the asset. So there is a huge amount of influence and control that you can have. As you move away from that, you're effectively diluting both the direct influence as well as the potential to generate specific incremental data points easily or in a cost-effective manner for those assets. So what we find is, though, that I wouldn't underestimate the potential for influence within listed equities or even fixed income, even if you don't have voting rights. I've always been impressed by how willing companies are to actually take on feedback and listen to investor concerns on different topics. So I think it doesn't preclude constructive engagement or identification, but I would just highlight that you need to be conscious that you're operating in a less robust information environment. And so therefore you need to be targeted in terms of where is the main risk, what are we trying to remediate, and then being able to do the work to surface that. So we just, again, go back to highlighting the importance of targeting, the importance of fundamental research, and then having a clear set of identified asks or objectives that you're trying to achieve. So yeah, definitely different by different asset class. The one that becomes super funky is when we start looking at derivatives and other sorts of alternatives where you can have synthetic exposure to an issue, and then what level of influence or outcome should you be trying to have on that underlying instrument, which is a little bit of a different topic, but yeah, just a spectrum of information and influence is how I think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, we won't go down the derivatives rabbit hole here today, but I completely hear you on that issue. Saskia, do you have any advice in addition to what's already been said around the asset class-based approach?
I think the only one that I'd add is what Nina was mentioning on a sovereign level, which I think is really fascinating. Like, obviously there's the high risk areas, and there's plenty of different metrics that you could look for in that area, but there's also an opportunity on the sovereign side. So in certain markets, like the influence that you're going to have on US sovereign debt, I don't know who is on the line, but probably everybody is way too small to actually set the terms of anything coming out there. But if you look at particular emerging markets, if they're restructuring their debt, so for example, in the past we did work with the World Bank on Ghana, and actually looked at child labor factors in that country. If you look at a long-term ability to repay debt in an emerging market, you want to have an educated workforce. A high number of children participating in child labor and helping in the cacao industry can actually make that a lot more difficult. So working with the government in that instance on implementing education policies and taking some of these factors to reduce child labor can actually influence the ability of the country to repay their debt over the long term. So there's an opportunity as well where you have that you potentially have in some emerging markets that you might not necessarily have on the developed market side.
Yeah, that's an incredibly interesting point. Just before we move on to our audience questions, we do have a few audience questions, but just one final point before we move on to those for all of you. For investors that are at the very early stages of human rights due diligence, they might be building out their ESG frameworks or building out their human rights framework specifically. What recommendations do each of you have to getting started? What's the starting point for someone who's starting with a blank page, so to speak? Saskia, do you want to go first?
I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier. It's do you want to go broad or do you want to go narrow and deep? My personal recommendation would be to go pick a couple of companies where you want to set up an engagement plan and learn from that before you roll it out too broadly. If you're going to say we're going to assess human rights risk across our portfolio and work with every single company, you're probably not going to succeed. And that might make it harder to implement a program in the long term. So pick a company where you think you have leverage. And I think that was what Gabe mentioned earlier. Make sure you have the leverage, you have enough access to data and information from various sources so you can build up an informed engagement plan and set yourself up for success. Because once you've delivered something successful and you've added value to the investment team, you've been able to implement it, you're much more likely to be able to build it out long term.
That's excellent advice, and I would also say that it's a continuous improvement process. So where if you think about building out your whole human rights due diligence framework all at once, it's quite overwhelming, and it's also hard to get stakeholders over the line. So taking it, setting goals for yourself, and this is something that we certainly have done. If we think back when we first started many years ago, setting goals each year for continuous improvement and achieving them, you'll be able to do that in a much more effective way. Nina, do you have any advice for someone who's getting started for the first time?
I think you touched on it, is that internal stakeholder engagement. So making sure you get those key people on board early. So for example, if you're new, or even if you're changed role, making sure you meet with all the different heads of the different asset classes, or the different heads of the business, and also the analysts, talking to them, having coffee, saying, what are you doing? Like, have you ever come across a human rights related issue? Or, maybe you use it in terms of like occupational health and safety or modern slavery, if they, human rights seems a bit too broad. What sort of tools do you use? So I think it's really important at first to get those internal stakeholders on board. That way you're making your human rights team of one a human rights team of 100 or more, so it's really important to get those internal, and also to not dismiss the work that's already been done. So they guarantee every organization has dealt with a human rights related issue. Whether they've done it effectively or not might be questioned, but to understand what they've learned previously. And then I think building from there, what tools do you already have? So if you go in straight away saying, I need this $400,000 subscription to do my job, I think you'll come across with some headbutting here. So I think it's really important at first to understand what the organization is currently doing. So what the due diligence process currently looks like, and how then you can add a human rights lens on top of that. So I think it's definitely really important to make sure you're integrated as part of the investment team, and not just a random add-on as well.
Completely agree. And as we all know, as ESG professionals, stakeholder engagement is one of the most important parts of our roles. So yes, and human rights, it's so important that we are engaging stakeholders from across the business. Gabe, any advice for someone getting starting with a blank page on human rights due diligence?
Completely agree with what was just said. I would also highlight that there is a huge amount of resource in the market that you can look at in order to get started here, in that whether this is joining collaborative engagements and learning and shadowing another engagement to see how other people undertake these sorts of engagements, due diligence toolkits, other sorts of components that are in the market to help upskill and understand what you're doing here. It's definitely, even if you've got a blank piece of paper, you're not starting from scratch or starting alone in the space. There's a huge amount of support that exists in order to help get people up to speed. And then completely just reiterating Nina's final point, in that the idea of making sure that it is complementing and supporting an existing investment process and not inconsistent with the objective of what the firm is trying to achieve as well. So it's calibrating what you're trying to achieve and where you're targeting to maximize success, and the fact that it can then be replicated internally. So getting a case of where it's aligned with an investment process and outcome and adding value, and then using that as being able to build into a more comprehensive framework for risk identification and assessment can be a really powerful way of starting out and getting that alignment to make sure it's a long-term initiative that's being implemented. And again, just to completely agree with Saskia's comment, don't try and go straight for a gold-plated board-approved policy. Think about what you're trying to achieve and building up towards that. So incrementally starting. And I guarantee, to Nina's opening points, you will have data within your organization or publicly available that can get you a significant way down that track in terms of risk assessment or due diligence. You don't need a huge amount of higher expensive data to get started here. You'll have the tools and resources you need. So it's just about being focused and targeted.
Or
Charlotte, can I add one more?
Yeah,
listening to
Yeah.
both of them, which I think, especially for your stakeholder management internally, is equip yourself with case studies of how has it been done by others and how does it work. Especially if you work with people who are newer to the area, you can use it as a training opportunity and go like, this is an example of how it was done. This is what happened in the company. These were the indicators. This is how it looked. Like, have 3 or 4 case studies, and there are a couple of really useful ones in the tool already that are relevant to the particular analyst. So have some mining examples if you're meeting with a mining analyst, have some financial examples if you're meeting with a banking analyst about what a human rights due diligence process would look like for that particular sector. That will really help you in your conversations internally.
Great advice. All of that advice is excellent for anyone getting started, and also those of us who are well on the journey. So I really appreciate all of your contributions. We've got quite a number of questions from the audience, so I'll get started and we'll cover as much as we can, but if not, we might have to send out some written comments after the call. So the first question, what are the main challenges in integrating human rights due diligence into global supply chains? And what is the strategy to ensure that companies are not reluctant to carry out human rights due diligence? Who'd like to get started on that one?
I think the reluctance, we kind of touched on it, is, you make sure you're prepared if someone says, how is this relevant to us? Like, how can we impact this? Some of those big questions, like, we have such a large exposure. This is just a tiny grain in, the beach of what we invest in. Making sure that you have examples that you can put forward and say, if we do this tangible thing, or I've done this tangible thing here and it's resulted in these positive outcomes, or have those case studies that you have in the guide, Boohoo, where it's, severely impacted the investment portfolio. So I think it's really important to have those sticky conversations and be prepared, and to be prepared to sometimes really ask people, like, this is the right thing to do. It like, when it comes down to it, it's the right thing to do. No one, if you talk to them, doesn't care about a death. No one doesn't care about someone experiencing torture or forced labor if you really talk to them about it. So I think it's really about making sure you're comfortable in having those sticky and difficult conversations, and that there's a space to have them as well. So I think I'll pass on to others in terms of what they wanted to add, but I think lots of people do get uncomfortable, but I love it when I get a hard question like that, and I think it's really easy to win people over and for them to realize, actually, we can have an impact, whether we're a smaller investment manager or a large super fund. We can positively impact human rights.
Saskia and Gabe, any thoughts on that question?
Okay, I'll keep it short, but I generally like a carrot and a stick approach. So the carrot, like, if you do this well, there's an operational benefit to it. There can be a positive brand impact from it. You know your supply chain better, which can help you prepare better for risk, which was particularly shown during the pandemic. And then in terms of the stick, you can go to your regulatory slide. A lot of these regulations that are coming in might not necessarily be in Australia, but you might export to certain markets, or you might have operations in a particular market. So you may be captured under some of these regulatory initiatives anyway. And then obviously the national contact point from the OECD that's being increasingly leveraged by individuals to raise complaints also provides reputational risk, operational risk, legislation, and lawsuits and things like that. So use both this carrot and the stick in your arguments when needed.
And Gabe, anything further to add to those points?
I completely agree with what was just said. What I find can be helpful is, and this is coming from more of an Asia supply chain, local companies engaging with these topics, they may not be as familiar with some of the terms, some of the big picture issues. And to Nina's point, they want to do the right thing, but what does that actually mean? And so I find translating the ask into something concrete that is linked to a business reality for the company can be a really effective way of getting through the door and actually having that constructive discussion around, are you aware of what's happening in your supply chain, what the risks are in different areas? And this can even start with just have you done a risk assessment? Here's some case studies of people in your sector who have had withhold and release orders in the US, who have had divestments, who have had all of these other sorts of issues. This is actually a financial issue that we're worried about. How are you thinking about integrating that into your business, and are you aware of these risks? Can be a really good way to open the door and start that discussion. And then that can broaden into other areas. But it is about building that trusted relationship, that you're there as a partner to help, and that you're looking at it from a very practical standpoint as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Building on what was just said around the sensitivity of human rights due diligence, another question here around human rights due diligence and internal and external stakeholder management. So, as human rights due diligence might be a sensitive issue that shows how an organization is putting in effort in this area, how do internal stakeholders in an organization manage and integrate into this issue, into finance and investment, to prevent miscommunication to external stakeholders? Does anyone want to start there?
I think I already answered a little bit of this in my previous response, but I think in terms of, we are, I guess, experiencing a bit of a green hushing, and I would also say a bit of a blue hushing, in terms of a lot of investors not wanting to do more and maybe say less, especially in terms of the asset greenwashing guidance as well. So it is kind of, I do think that it's important to have external reporting, but I also think it's really important to be doing those actions so you can confidently summarize what you're doing and it not be considered blue washing, so which is the human rights version of greenwashing as well. So I think we are seeing a lot of more legal teams within, like legal support within sustainable investment teams, but I just think it's really important that the additional legal support doesn't mean that we're doing less actions, that maybe we're just a bit more careful about what we say, and it's really, really important when we're reporting as well that we don't make things worse for people on the ground, that we don't affect someone's privacy, that we don't, and there have been issues of companies doing this, right? Publishing a stakeholder case, like a case study about the community, and then those communities being adversely impacted by that. So I guess there is a balance there of making sure we have reporting, but it doesn't negatively impact persons and their privacy as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think if you're going to disclose something to market, make sure that you're doing it in a robust, detailed way behind the scenes. I think as well, particularly those jurisdictions that have legislation in this area, the knowledge in the market, the knowledge among your stakeholders, your external stakeholders, if you're a listed company, that is the analysts that are invested in looking at your reports, or other stakeholders, they have much more knowledge and sophistication in this area, and they will be looking in detail at your external disclosures. So I think making sure that you do have those processes behind the scenes, and that you do, to your point, Nina, have the right people, be it legal, finance, risk. It's not just an ESG or sustainability issue. That's really important. Just one final question in the 2 minutes we've got remaining, but there was a discussion on the complexity, difficulties for an investor engaging with parties who may be impacted by an investee party's operation. So the Indigenous communities, if we think about the communities impacted by a company's operations. Do you have any specific examples or guidance on some of those difficulties for an investor engaging on some of these community-based issues? So maybe if we think about Indigenous issues, do you have any case studies quickly in the last couple of minutes to share that people can think about?
There was one of the brokers in Australia hosted a series of meetings whereby NGOs in different mining sites were explaining what their challenges were with regards to the local operations, the communication challenges they had with the various mining companies in those instances, how they were working. And I think that that was a really interesting format whereby the broker was, as a neutral party, offering the opportunity for investors to engage with local NGOs and local communities on the challenges that they were facing. Going back to the earlier discussion that we had, is trying to take a range of sources and a range of information when preparing for company engagements that really provided a different perspective. So I think it's really important that that conversation takes place, but on your own, that can be really difficult to do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good example. And there are many examples out there in the market in many different formats. But yes, that's a really good example in the final minute we have. So I will wrap there. We could talk about this for another half an hour, I'm sure, but that was a really insightful discussion. I learnt a lot, and I hope you all did too. And I would like to thank our panelists, Saskia, Nina, and Gabe, for joining me today, and for Altiorum and the team for developing this excellent expert guide. I would encourage all of you to read it and really interact with it, use it in your processes, in building out your human rights due diligence frameworks. And thank you to Altiorum for producing really helpful resources like this. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.